All right. Welcome to Bad Trenches Part 1, The Ram. My name is Velth. My pronouns are he and him. Uh, the purpose of this video today, it's going to be a longer one. This is largely beginning the process of talking about some of the common uh, mistakes I see being made by people digging trenches in the battlefield. This is intended to be a more practical thing. I know that there are reasons why people tend to dig these trenches. So for these videos, we're going to try and cover, you know, what it is that people want to accomplish with these trenches, why it is that these trenches are not ideal, and possible ways that you can actually accomplish the goals in maybe a better or more reasonable way, right? Um, so before we get into this, wanted to throw out a disclaimer. I've kind of modified some of the notation a little bit. The previous notation still applies, but uh, these two new notations you can see here, just a straight line for barbed wire and a dash line for sandbags. I got lazy. It was just a little bit easier for me to draw things this way, and sometimes when I was trying to fiddle with things, draw and erase stuff, it just was a lot faster to do it this way. So first, what is a ram, right? A battering ram, you know, kind of a classic medieval siege weapon. It's essentially just a log that just swing in a straight line in order to break down uh, a barricade, right? Um, you can see one here on the right. I don't know why they're using it against a stone wall. Maybe that's one of the applications. I think it's usually more for doors. But this leads to the rise of something known as the ram or a battery in chess. This is kind of following the same principle, right? You have two rooks here, the pieces that can move in, uh, cardinal directions, lined up in a line, with the intent being that the lead rook can kind of move in a straight line, smashing into a castle position, which you got up here in the top right, with the rear rook protecting it so that anything that attempts to capture the forward rook gets hit by the second one. And you may be thinking, what the fuck does that have to do with anything? So here is a ram in Foxhole, kind of in the same vein as the former two rams, right? You have one trench laid out in a vertical orientation, so assume that, you got your team is down here at the bottom, the enemy team's up towards the top, right? You've dug one trench in a straight line from your team towards the enemy, and then you sit here up in the top using the lip as cover, and then dig another trench, right? And you continue to dig these in a straight line in the same way that a ram in chess would just kind of move in a straight line towards the enemy, with the intention being each previous trench in the chain provides cover to the sapper as they're digging the next trench, right? This is largely because the way that digging things in Foxhole works, you're able to like shovel at something that's immediately adjacent to you, even if it's through a wall, right? So you can shovel trenches even from inside of a bunker without a door. You can shovel trenches from the end of other trenches, right? And you can do it pretty much safely because it's really hard for anybody to shoot you unless they just stand right on top of you. So it's a great way to sort of advance defenses while remaining safe. And this proves to be a large part of the reason why I think a lot of new players tend to dig trenches like this. They see where the enemy is, they see where they are, they'd like to get over there without getting shot, and they know that they can dig the next stage of the trench safely, and then they're only briefly exposed for a moment while they have to run up to the lip of it before they can dig the next one. However, it kind of causes a problem, right? So you can see here, imagine someone has just kept digging 4 or 5 straight pieces in a row. The lip up here is the only real part of this trench that is providing any cover, and it only provides cover to maybe like about here where my cursor is. And then all the way back down here is the back wall, right? And that back wall cover, if you'll remember, that's the one that provides the protection from getting aimed at. So that's completely out of the picture, right? You got no standard cover, and you're definitely not in defilade, right? So anybody kind of moving along here is going to get shot, right? Seems pretty obvious. Uh, you also don't have any egress. If someone were to, say you've got troops bunched up at the head here, if they throw a gas grenade over behind you down here, you're just kind of dead. There's no way to get out of the trench aside from trying to clamber out over the sides and get shot while you're doing it. It's really hard to conceal yourself because, normally in a trench you can kind of crouch down and move along these things somewhat invisibly in order to reposition yourself. There's obviously none of that that's going to happen. And really, these sorts of plans, right? The reason why these trenches can get so long is largely because the guys who are digging them are up here in the one safe part of the trench. And that works out fine. They're able to make a pretty good headway until something goes wrong. Somebody throws a grenade in behind them and they're not able to get out, or a guy just runs up to the edge here and shoots them, right? And as soon as that happens and this like forward piece is no longer controlled by the guys digging it, all hell starts to break loose. So here is an example, a real life example of a ram in progress. There were some guys up here digging it, but they've already been hit by a grenade and killed at this point. Um, I'm including this largely because I want people to know that I'm not just talking out of my ass when I say that like these trenches get built. There's going to be some other ones later on, um, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm, making stuff up for clout. These things really do tend to get built quite frequently, and it's usually for, like I said, it's because somebody wants to be able to safely advance down a position, and they don't really think about the fact that you know they're creating a vulnerable position behind them that other people are going to have to deal with. Um, and similarly, like I've you know I've stopped some guys who are digging things like these, but even when you point out to them that hey, there's a whole lot of problems, like how are we going to deal with grenades, how are we going to get up here, what happens if an enemy just sits at the end of this thing, right? They'll acknowledge those problems. They can kind of see them, but they can't see what else they could do, right? So like in this case, look at this huge field these guys have to work with. Oh, hang on. Let's go back a slide. Ugh. Right? They got this huge field to work with, right? But they're sticking themselves right down on this road because that's the fastest way for them to start advancing this trench. Um, so yeah, over here on the side, right? The idea that they can only fight what they've already captured, right? In terms of where they can look, they're going to have good cover. They can only really look off to the right here, right? So the only space that they can sort of safely attack is the space that in theory they've already captured because ideally they're going to be up here. This whole area is already going to be clear, so you don't need guys lined up along here aiming out into this field, right? You can already see down here, trenches are only about wide enough for two guys to pass, and that's not necessarily reliable. You can see here, I think that might be a medic, or just maybe a partisan. These two guys are struggling to get past each other, right? And look at how many guys are in this trench, right? So what happens then if an enemy were to make it up here, right? Well, this happens. As you can see, the trench is now completely cleared the whole way down. This Bardiche has done the smart thing, right? It's moved right up to the edge of the trench, and now it's able to just mulch everybody along this entire track, right? You'll notice that there's absolutely nobody left here. This is taken only a few seconds later, and that's largely because all those guys just got machine gunned, right? Very few of them actually managed. You can see there's no bodies. I mean, there's no bodies here in general, but there's no bodies or backpacks along the side, and that's because nobody was able to climb out in time before they just got machine gunned, right? Um, and by contrast, right, you can see that like up here along this area would have been a little bit safer for them to hold. You can't see it, but off screen I'm in another horizontal trench. And even though this tank right here is trying to machine gun me and some of the people around me, it can't really do anything because that horizontal trench actually provides us the cover that a trench is supposed to, right? So let's say, you know, all right, don't dig a trench in a straight line right at your enemy, right? Because it's just kind of a bad idea. It doesn't really give you anything useful. It traps your guys into a meat grinder, and the biggest advantage that you might gain is, well, maybe the enemy will recapture this trench and also be stuck in a meat grinder. And that's just, you're kind of just hoping that everybody's going to have a real terrible time at that point. You might as well not be digging. So let's start with putting some angles on a trench. I kind of hate this piece of advice because a lot of people will trot it out because they saw it in like a History Channel show talking about World War One trenches. That well, the real way that they dug them was in these zigzags. But few times do people actually really think about why that is, or you know how it applies to a video game. But in this case, right, putting some angles on that trench is better than just leaving it as a straight line, right? Um, because as you can see, right, if a guy was sitting up here with a machine gun, well, he's only going to be able to kill the people in this part of the trench, right? So it slows down the rate at which everybody's going to kind of get mulched. It's still not good, and it's more of a pain in the ass to dig because these side to side ones are connector trenches, which take a little bit more shoveling, and they don't quite go as far. But it's definitely better to take the time to do this over digging a straight line, which is just not giving you anything. But let's see if we can improve it a little bit more, right? This is kind of the same diagonal back and forth zigzag, except that we've added sandbags, right, along the sides. And you can see that, like, even though we still have problems, right? There's no way to get in and out of this trench quickly. You don't really have much of a line of sight coming out of any of these trenches, right? Like down here, half your line of sight is eaten up by more of the trench in your own sandbags, right? But for an enemy coming into this trench, the only thing that they can really do is either look backwards at their own guys to see them advancing or run forward around blind corners, right? So compared to that, being able to shoot a little bit out of this trench, and being able to maybe approach it safely from one side to clear enemies out of it and then hop in, that's a pretty big advantage, right? We've gone from, a straight line that's just going to kill you and everyone involved to kind of a zigzag that's not really going to do any good for your team, but at least it's going to kill you all slower, to a trench that could reasonably be argued to be in your team's favor, right? But it's still not great. So we're going to add another improvement, right? We're going to go back to our make sure that there are at least 2 points of egress, right? And just add, this is kind of at the peak of one of the zigzags. Just sticking a standard trench in here to put some stairs on it. This is a pretty dramatic improvement as well, right? So now you can see you can actually sit in one of these, one along one of these diagonals and use it effectively. You're not going to have more line of sight. You're going to get a little bit more because of the padding, that this provides, but not by much. But importantly, you can sit there and not have to worry about somebody hucking a grenade at you because you've got more options in terms of getting out. This is also really great for medics. Uh, Medics really hate it when the only way to rescue a soldier is by hopping into a trench with no way to get back out of it safely, because that kind of commits them to being in there and getting shelled. Whereas with stairs like these, soldiers in here who get downed can be evacuated up top and then treated by a medic, and then they can get back in nice and safely. Or a medic who has to run in here to get somebody or save them can get back out without having to crawl over the back or just, deal with being stuck in this like endless tube, right? You can also see now, like, we've got a little bit more cover from the sandbags so that you can more safely approach. And importantly, you can safely approach up into this pocket here, clear down this next trench, and then cross over the trench to the other side, and then from these sandbags clear the next diagonal, which would look like this, right? And then walk up there, cross to the other side, and rinse and repeat, right? You can see it's a lot easier to go through and clear these trenches. Some people are probably going to say, yeah, but that makes it easier for the enemy to get out of these trenches, right? Like, it's not like the stairs have a turnstile on them. Um, and kind of the response to that is, sure, the enemy can get out of these trenches easier, But the correct move for the enemy, right? Imagine you're now up at this top side. You're trying to attack down to the bottom. You hop into this trench. Well, you can't look at the enemy here, so you move forward. Well, you can't look at them here, and you can't look at them here. And if you kind of come up to this area, you can look sidelong at them, which is probably not super relevant. And so your best bet is to walk out of the trench, right? To just get back out where you can actually see enemies and fight them. And I would argue that if your enemy's best move is to exit the trench, you have successfully made the trench a bad place for the enemy to stand. Even if it's not going to actively get him killed, right? Even if he could run away from a grenade, I'd be like, why are you throwing grenades at him? He's probably not going to be standing in here to begin with, and even if he is, just walk up along the sandbag line and shoot him, right? So the fact that these stairs benefit the enemy in terms of escaping from gas doesn't really matter to us because gas isn't the means by which we're going to clear this trench. And the fact that the enemy can get in and out or traverse sides doesn't really matter to us because the purpose of this trench isn't to seal the enemy off from being able to cross it. The purpose of this is to give us a way to safely move forward, which it does. Um, and I'm just, personally not bothered by the idea that the enemy exists outside of the trench. But let's say, for example, you go to build this, right? This is going to be one of the first things. You can remember back on the slide, right, that we originally had showing the actual disaster, the actual screenshots, right? We had a road like this one here, and then we had guys building real tight to that road. Now, in that screenshot, they didn't have this big kind of rock or cliff face here on the left, but we can imagine there's going to be a scenario where you do, right? Where you can imagine a scenario like this, where you've got kind of a narrow gap between, say, a road and a cliff, and you're down here at the bottom, your enemy's up at the top, and what you want to do is be able to safely move towards the enemy, right? And you may say, look, the idea of building these zigzags with the intermediate connectors, that's great and all, but the big connectors require a lot of side-to-side space. And maybe we just aren't going to have that, right? Wouldn't it be better, even in this one instance, right? Let's say it gets even more absurd. You can't even do the zigzag, right? It gets real narrow up here. We can't even like go back and forth like this. Wouldn't it make sense to just put a straight line trench going through this tight area? And the answer is no, right? A lot of people may not expect it, but the answer is just no. In circumstances like that, you got to ask yourself, what is the point of being in the trench versus getting out of the trench, walking through the narrow area, and then getting into another trench when the space opens up more, right? The idea would be, well, it provides me cover from something. But as we've already seen, if you're building like long straight trenches, if you do this for like one trench length, two trench lengths, that's probably fine. But if you're building three or four of these, right, you're not actually benefiting at all from the trenches that you're building because they're not giving you any cover from an enemy who's waiting at the other end of that trench. They're giving you cover from the road and the cliff. And assuming that this cliff is elevated and this road is going to have a tank on it, right? That's not really a lot, you know? Maybe you could make the argument that like having a vertical one here gives you a bit of an ability to hide from a tank, and if the enemy's being really, really aggressive with their tanks and not bothering checking trenches at all, you could hide in here and pop out and maybe do something. I guess, and assuming you kind of have the understanding that like this trench doesn't exist for the purposes of protecting the infantry, maybe you could make that argument. But there's the counter argument to be made of if you dig this vertical trench here in order to attack this road in an ambush, your tanks get ambushed too, right? There isn't, I can't tell you, well, sandbag it, because if you sandbag it, you're defeating the purpose of trying to ambush the tanks on it. And if you don't sandbag it and your tanks try and do the same thing, the enemy can fuck you up the exact same way. So really, like, I just wouldn't recommend bothering to dig it, right? It it's not worthwhile to put something into place unless you personally know that your team's going to be able to control it, right? That said, let's propose, right, a thinner variant, right? Something that is a little bit of a compromise. You don't want to do the zigzag because it doesn't have any egress. You need to go through something that's a little bit too thin to do those like horizontal interspliced trenches. Here's something that I propose. I have never seen this done. This is something I'm coming up with a little bit off the cuff, right? But as you can see, you've got these staircases in order to let your guys kind of get out of the trenches if they need to. It's really important on something like this that you're going to have barbed wire because what you don't want is an enemy like running into the trench here, coming down, back out, back into the trench, right? Constantly changing elevation, constantly changing sides. But you can see there's a lot of downsides with something like this. The actual points of egress are kind of weird. Like you technically have access to two within range, but trying to run forward to get out isn't super great. And the sandbags here, right, are not providing you anywhere near as much cover as they normally would, even on just a diagonal, because they keep getting cut short, right? Um, I couldn't tell you if this is better or worse. It's an idea to consider. If you don't really want to do just triangles and you can't do the horizontals, maybe test something like this out. If you do, hey, record it, send me pictures of it, see how it goes for you. But this kind of like pre-planning of what you're going to do, and especially if you're looking for something that can advance, pre-planning something that can tessellate like this, where you can keep sticking more and more on top of each other without changing the conditions, um, can be a really valuable thing, right? Because you can sort of you can plan things like this out and then go, you know what, this doesn't serve my purposes at all. This isn't robust enough. Uh, and speaking of pre-planning, this is my attempt, I was going to put a slide in here that was like, hey, what if you just wanted to tessellate like a pretty basic, orthogonal, I don't want to bother with the connector trenches sort of deal, right? Um, these are some problems that I hit thinking that I could just off the cuff come up with something entirely new, right? You can see here I've got one sort of orthogonal T shape, a second one, and then I'm realizing that if I put another uh, standard trench here, I'm going to wind up creating this donut, right? And that's no good because at that point, this side piece it's not doing anything for us, and this is just going to turn into another ram, right? So that I had to scrap, and then I thought, well, what if you put, just a little kind of curve like that, and you can, but you can kind of see that like this is sort of a weird pattern that winds up like stacking these T shapes in a perfect line with each other. That's not terribly useful. I mean, maybe you could argue it's a little bit because like someone standing here can shoot down this vertical piece of this one. Um, but I wasn't really impressed with this. It was eating up a lot of space. I didn't feel like it was really uh, making too much progress. The only real like amount of moving forward that it's getting is from this little elbow here. Um, and this is really just to highlight that like I'm not somebody who knows really everything about digging trenches. Everybody's kind of got to work this stuff out for themselves and get creative with it. And just before you go to dig something complex, right? Something that's going to have a lot of different pieces in order to make it work. At the very least, it behooves you to map it out because it may sound great in your head, and then you may, put down your, let's see, first, second, third, fourth. You may put down your fifth trench and realize that you've completely fucked yourself. That said, um, I did make kind of another design like this, to demonstrate another idea of, right, when you're going to build these kind of advancing trenches, it can be a good idea to try and think about from what positions could you safely shoot someone who tries to get into the trench, right? So here we've got like a line of sandbags along this trench. Um, so okay, from here, right, you can see like I've got a line of sandbags placed here, right? My thinking being, if an enemy gets into this trench, I don't want them to be able to shoot out to the side, but this creates kind of a vulnerability, which I can then cover with a further back position, right? Enemies can't stack up here and kill guys who are gonna be moving into this area because the guys who would move into those area can kill those enemies first, right? This is also, and similarly, right? I've got barbed wire along this front here to stop enemies from getting in. They could get in at the staircase, but again, that staircase can be covered by a nearby further back position. You want to make sure it's nearby because your troops can't be relied on to like stack defenses extremely deeply. But here where like this could be the fighting front, having a guy, 1, 2 trench lanes back is not unreasonable. It's still very likely this guy isn't going to exist, but it's possible. Um, this is also just demonstrating though that like when you're trying to build an advancing trench, these harsh right angles, these orthogonal pieces, they are difficult to work with. You can see here, right? I've got sandbags all along this inner side, right? But because there's no slant to these pieces, these sandbags on this side are kind of ambiguous in terms of what they are doing, right? They're facing just directly out into a side, which means that it's hard to tell whether or not these sandbags are going to be used for our troops approaching or for enemy troops approaching, and whether these sandbags are going to be blocking the enemy from shooting us or us from shooting the enemy. Now, if instead, right, these pieces here were on kind of a slant going this way, you could easily see that, like, the sandbags on this side of a slant that goes like this, right, would be protecting our troops while they're approaching them. But when it's these like straight up and down configurations where the enemy's ahead of you, your troops are behind, those orthogonal pieces, especially when they're moving forward like this, are very ambiguous. They become very hard to lock down with sandbags. And as you know, I love sandbags. They are the number one way to make sure the trench is truly your team's. So if I could recommend something that maybe is going to go down as a permanent rule, it's any trench that is intended to advance soldiers or provide soldiers access further forward in the battlefield, it has to be angled because you can't secure it otherwise, right? Um, so here, little tidbit for sort of bunker focused folks, um, talking about adding choke points, right? These are just tier 2 um, no AI bunkers. They probably are going to have a window, right, facing up into these diagonals. Like I said in that last slide, all these advancing trenches are diagonal, which means that it's a lot easier to place these sandbags on them. With the windows in these bunkers, these diagonals can be cleared, and because this is a bunker with a window, right, an enemy who, say, runs in down here is going to quickly find they can't shoot out this way, they can't shoot out the bunker here, and if they try and advance this way, they just hit a wall, and they have to come back out and go around again. Um, Having these be tier 2 bunkers, you can see these are sandbags up on the roof, stairs to get up there. It gives you a nice little, spot where you can kind of have a little bit more of a wide angle to shoot enemies, get a little bit of elevation. It's not a huge deal, but it's something, right? Having a contrast between troops that are down low, troops that are up high, and then even troops that are in here where, say, mortars or something can't touch them. That's kind of a nice thing to work together. Um, the downside to doing something like this is when your troops are going to advance, they're going to come up here, right? And then they have to go out, and then they have to hop this, and they have to go out, and they have to hop that, right? In my experience, a lot of what troops are going to do is they're going to run up here. They're going to maybe do the Frogger hopping from trench to trench, but probably they're just going to go out and around and just ignore all of this, right? So, like, you can safely dig these things somewhat, um, but your troops are probably either going to go around them or more likely they're going to come up here the second time, walk in here, tear off your window, put a door in, and then keep moving up. And at that point, they've sort of defeated the point of having this like as a fixed choke point that the enemy couldn't get through. You might be able to argue that like, hey, if we're losing, we can run up and rip the door back off of this and turn it back into a wall. You could also make the argument that like even if these were open doors, you can still have, like our troops can safely move in this area, get up on top of here, kill enemies who are down here or enemies who are trying to get in. And so even though we don't control the underside of this bunker, because we control the top side, we've still got a pretty good advantage and can still clear this trench effectively. But for the purposes of like controlling access into this trench, the bunkers are really good, but they're probably going to get sabotaged by your own guys, right? So now, right, that's basically, you know, all the ideas that I've had as far as safe ways to advance, right? Try to make sure that you always have those 2 points of egress. Try to make sure that your advancing trenches are always angled, and you want to make sure that they're angled so that it is clear how you can sandbag them in order to safely keep them neutral. Try to think about whether or not adding a bunker or some other physical barrier to prevent enemies from moving in the opposite direction is going to be worthwhile. It's probably at this stage something that's worth just experimenting with and seeing how it goes. Both experimenting with putting a wall up and seeing if your troops are willing to deal with that, and uh, putting in a door and seeing if the door, you know, really ruins the way that this whole thing works or if it's pretty tolerable, right? Um, and here on the left side, I just want to remind you guys, right? Always, 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 before you start digging, plan what you're going to do. Make sure the blueprints can fit. If you're doing something big and funky, like one of these tessellating things, make sure that all of the pieces that you're going to need to build a secure trench can be placed down. Put them down as blueprints, hit them once, and make sure that they'll all be able to fit, right? Don't just assume and then get halfway into digging something and realize that you fucked up. Always, like in the first video, make sure that you stage your materials, make sure that you bring out all the sandbags and whatnot you're going to need, make sure that you put them on as soon as possible so that you don't leave naked trenches. Don't get into the habit of thinking, well, I'll just build, I'll build 3 or 4 of them and then I'll start sandbagging. You want to do it literally as soon as they go up for every single component because you don't want, you know, to have this long, nice trench that helps your troops advance, and then the very last 2 pieces of it didn't get sandbags on them, and the enemy is just camped out there, stymieing your entire advance, right? Um, that's kind of, the best I got for you. Uh, don't build rams. Don't don't dig in a straight line. Especially don't dig in a straight line towards the enemy. Uh, if they're gonna, shoot all of you, make them at least work for it a little bit. Um, good luck. I'll see you all guys in the future.